Thank you, everyone. We're going to talk about incrementality this morning. All right, mastering incrementality. A bit of a tough thing to do sometimes because it can be difficult to measure. There can be a lot of third parties out there that claim to help you measure it. Some of those have more accurate methods than others. We're going to talk about the pros and cons of different approaches and share a bit of data from what we're seeing in the incrementality studies that we've done here at RTB House. And by the way, I'm Jaysen Gillespie, as Howie said earlier. Delighted to be over here in London. Obviously, I don't sound like the British gentleman that Howie is, but I represent both the US market as the head of analytics, and I'm also our global head of product marketing. So again, delighted to be here, and without further ado, let's get the presentation going. So this problem is not new. This is a famous American salesman who was, like many of you here, a retailer, in fact. John Wanamaker is credited with probably the most famous quote in advertising, which is "the half my money is wasted. I just don't know which half." I believe he said this, it's hard to find the exact year he said it. If you can find it, let me know. But he's born in 38 and died in 1922, so probably sometime in the mid to late 1800s. Looking at this room, some of you weren't even born then. Some of your grandparents, most of your grandparents weren't even born. I actually looked it up. I asked my mom. Her grandmother was born in 1876, and she's 86 now. So this was a very long time ago. Problem has been around forever, basically. The other piece of this that's more recent that we touched on earlier was about Google Analytics. All right, so the joke, at least over in, actually, anyone from Google here? Good. Okay, so with no one from Google here, we can tell you what we really think, right? Which is, so the joke over in America, when we moved from Universal Analytics into the GA4, that's great. This is a great product. Everyone says that except marketers, which, by the way, are the core intended audience. Like, the data analysts love it because it's got BigQuery underneath, and you can actually pull all this powerful data out of it, and it gives them lifetime employment until AI can do it. And Google loves it because it's this revolutionary thing, and it's different, and we're going to take something that worked pretty well for 15 years and we're going to change it. So it really, though, isn't well-loved by a lot of marketers, almost the overwhelming feedback, and that was self-evident, because if you remember what happened, Google said, hey, you all need to be on this new software sometime the middle of 2023. Middle of 2023 comes, it's kind of like a real ID. If you're American, you're supposed to have this special ID to fly, and they've delayed it 9 years. And so no one wanted to do it, and Google said, I'm going to give you all 1 more year. And almost everybody took that 1 more year, and then finally go say, okay, time's up. Unlike the cookie, we're going to actually do something here and kind of force you over to it. And that sort of indicates that there's not a lot of market acceptance. And as Howie mentioned, one of the big changes is the way that the attribution works in GA, where they've migrated you into a DDA or data-driven attribution. You can change it. You don't have to stay with that, right? If you don't like your DDA, you can switch it over to last click, or they have 2 or 3 other attribution models still in there. But many people just take the defaults and run with it. And sorry, I put the clicker down. And it broke the continuity that you and marketers had been enjoying for a very long time. GA really hadn't changed materially for probably 10 or 15 years. That's longer than probably most of us were really intimately involved with it. That's a long-term relationship. So the traditional metrics are struggling to keep up with the new need to measure the true value of what your marketing does, which is incrementality. You can look at clicks, you can learn about activity, but it doesn't tell you anything about the intent or even the true impact. You can look at site visits pre-purchase, meaning look at the path to purchase, which actually there's a lot of great data in GA4 because it tracks every visit. And as I said, if you have a strong data analytics team, you can really get in there and understand a lot about how your users are coming to your website and that path to purchase. And that's very worthwhile. But it doesn't have anything about causality, which is the concept that, hey, just because there was a click from, say, an affiliate, and after Google, affiliate is my second favorite thing to pick on because we have some evidence, believe it or not, that there are people, don't tell this to anyone in e-commerce, they will actually go out and just find a 10% off coupon code and come back to your website through it and make it look like that drove the purchase. That's coincidental, not causal, or correlated, but not causal. It's very hard to prove that that's a causal effect. Our personal view is if you have an affiliate program that's not discount, where you're really using it as a way to reach out to publishers, maybe I have a blog about like really awesome books, and I'm just saying this is an awesome book, click on it, buy something. Yeah, maybe more incremental. But if it's literally I'm just searching for a 10% off coupon code, then coming back and putting that in, no, that's not causality. And then even if you're looking at things like ROAS and CPA, again, it's not incremental, it's an attributed metric. And an attributed metric is great because it occurs as soon as the transaction occurs, right? There's a transaction, and for that same user, you can go and look back at everything that happened. Incrementality, though, is very different. It's much harder to understand, but it answers a more difficult question, which is if I had two worlds, and those worlds were identical to each other, and one world had this particular treatment, and this other world didn't have that treatment, what difference in outcomes would I observe? And if you observe a difference in outcomes, and everything else is the same, then it must be because of that difference in input. If you don't believe that, you're actually going to have a lot of problem with everything we know in about the last 500 years. It's the fundamental foundation of all knowledge, scientific method. So incrementality itself really just very much gets back to conceptual and almost philosophical basics around what works and what doesn't. For that reason, the really best way to do it, again, in our POV, is a true population split, where you're actually doing it using that scientific method, where you're saying, all right, this half of the room, you guys are seated pretty much randomly here, right? We could do one thing to this half of the room and one thing to this half of the room and see if we got any differences. You can take that same approach when you're dealing with people who come to your website. And if you're going to do it, ideally, you do it blind and you do it random. And that means, for example, random is just every 10th customer, every 5th customer. As long as you pick a true random sample, then the attributes of that sample or this side of the room would be the same as that side of the room. If 20% of these people, say are male, then 20% of these people would be male, and so forth. You like to do it blindly just to not bias yourself or your vendor. When we run these, we do a blind split and we do a random split so that we can make sure that there's as little bias as possible creeping into your control populations. It's one of the primary failure modes of these kinds of tests. Make sure that your control group is truly representative of the whole population and not biased in any way. One of the things that you may hear from less sophisticated vendors is, oh, well, we made a control group after the test from everybody who didn't get an ad. That's an exceptionally poor way of doing it. The reason a lot of people didn't get ads is because they weren't good enough people to warrant the display of an ad. Therefore, that's a mechanism to select a control group that I would strongly advise against. So be on the lookout for things like that don't make sense. And you come up with an A group and a B group. You stop showing ads in the B group. In the A group, you don't show everyone an ad, especially when you're using an AI system like ours. The value of our system is sorting those people into who should get ads, who should get a lot of ads, who should get a few ads, and who should get no ads. So there's some sort of subset here that gets an ad, which is why I'm not calling it the exposed group. I'm calling it the potentially exposed. So you've got a potentially exposed group here against an unexposed group. And then you sort of bring it all back together. And you see what you get. You look at the differences in performance. And if you look at everybody in the A group versus the B group, that's one way to do it. And that's called an ITT approach, or intent to treat. And it's important to understand what that means in order to draw a distinction with the next approach. Intent to treat is very common because when you use a third party, for example, and do a geo-based split, and we'll talk more about those, you do an intent to treat where you look at all the transactions that occur, say, in one region versus another. Because you don't actually know who is exposed. You're going off of transaction log data across an entire region. It's unbiased and it can work, but it's very noisy because there's a lot of people in here that maybe you didn't even show an ad to, and they're coming into your analysis. Clearly, if you don't show an ad to someone, you can't move the needle on an incremental transaction. So one thing here, Ask your vendors if they're doing this. Are they making any weird adjustments to try to reduce the noise or remove sales from unexposed users? And then pro tip 2, ask your vendor if they can, if they know it, what fraction of all the users in this A group were actually exposed to an ad. So for example, when we run these studies at RTB House, we'll split all your site visitors into A and B groups, and we'll show ads to some people in the A group. That's your reach. Usually it's 10, 20, 30%. It's not everyone. And so let's say it's 20%. That means when you use an ITT approach, 80% of the people up here we didn't show ads to, and that ends up just being noise. So there are good reasons to do this, and there are challenges doing this, especially for what I call mid-tier marketing tactics and channel, which is pretty much everything outside of perhaps email, direct, which isn't really a tactic, Google, Meta, which are usually like your top 4. Then you have all this other really valuable stuff like RTB House and other vendors, open web, DSPs, potentially even affiliate, that drive like a decent amount of your sales, but it's harder to do these sort of tests because you need less noise, because there's not as much data as there would be for, say, Google or Meta. So what do we do to help solve this? Because I mentioned that, we're not often as big a percent of your mix as Google or Meta. We'd love to be, and for a few of you we might be, but generally speaking, they're larger than us. So we have our own methodology that we call a ghost ads methodology. And this is something where we solve that problem of all the excess noise by coming in and drawing a lasso around the users in the A group who aren't just potentially exposed, but are actually exposed to marketing. And we compare that. That's pretty easy, right? You're thinking, well, Jaysen, that's not very hard. All you need is an impression log and a list of people that you showed ads to. You're exactly right. That's not very hard. Where it's hard is how do you figure out in the control group who would have seen those ads? And why is that hard? Because you're not showing any ads in the control group. So you have to have some mechanism for identifying who would have seen an ad, and it has to be very precisely done, excuse me, because they have to meet all the same criteria that these folks met. For example, let's say you chose to do a PSA. Common approach. I'm going to show an ad for some charity, the United Way. For example, I'm not sure which of these you have in Britain, but back in America, there's a United Way, and people use them to show an ad. The problem is that's biased. I'm saying, well, how's that biased? Wouldn't you just, go out into the SSPs and bid? If you bid the same amount for United Way ad, what happens? Well, believe it or not, let's say up here that it's Marks & Spencer. There are some websites that will not allow a Marks & Spencer ad. Websites can choose what ads they'll show and not show, but those same websites might allow the United Way ad. Now you've created a bias in which ad is displayed. You didn't intend to do it, but you did it. The internet did it for you, actually, behind the scenes through things like publisher side exclusion rules. So to avoid that, what we do is we just show one real ad. I know it sounds a little dorky because, wait a minute, you're not really supposed to show ads in a control group. But we show one real ad for the client, for your actual products and services. That way, it's unbiased. We know that these people would have truly been shown an ad because we've shown an ad. The publisher rules are the same, the bidding is the same, and the performance of that one ad is the same. We realize that slightly increases the water level in the control group, which for us actually makes our results a little more conservative. We happily take that because the increase in precision far outweighs that very slight loss in the true measurement. So that's one way that we've kind of fit that square peg into the round hole here. Other vendors will have different approaches, but I draw this out in some degree of gory detail simply to show the complexity that can exist behind the proper measurement of incrementality. What's neat, though, is with a deep learning system, we actually find that if you look at what percent of attributed sales are incremental, for most vendors, that's going to run 30, 50, maybe 75%. Typical machine learning approach is usually around 60%. We're actually running a pinch above 100, mostly based on US data, where deduplication from having many clicks before the transaction is perhaps a little more rampant than in some markets. But nonetheless, it's a demonstration that the incremental sales can actually exceed the attributed, that means that there are other things like affiliate, for example, that are coming in and swiping credit, but aren't actually driving a true transaction on an incremental basis. The reason this is true, we like to theorize, is that it's really deep learning is finally bringing marketing into the age of incrementality. These are actual results from studies from the US, and you can see two things. First of all, these are all over the map. This is the ratio of incremental sales to attributed sales. Again, attributed is mostly what you're looking at in Google Analytics or Adobe Analytics. You can see that there are times where it's like dramatically higher. There are times where the incremental is lower. So when I cite that we're better on an incremental basis, that's an average, and averages can be misleading. Right, the average height of a person is something like 5'7", but almost no one is 5'7". That I'm not sure resonates here. Do you guys you don't use feet? You do feet? Wait, why do you do feet? I thought you meters and all that. No, you do feet? Okay, so you're as dumb as us and you do feet, and the rest of the world does meters. But no one is 5'7", because the average woman is 5'4", and the average man is 5'9.5". So averages can be misleading, and I would encourage all of you to dig into those averages, de-average, and look at things client by client, or tactic by tactic, or vendor by vendor, because it can be very different. But it averages out slightly ahead, or at least the median. The other thing that's great about ghost ads is with that additional precision, you can ask some very interesting questions. And I've put the number one question that we get in the US market from marketers, which is, hey, should I be showing ads to people who've already bought from me? Don't those people sort of have an established buying pattern, and therefore the exposure of more advertising isn't likely to create additional truly incremental transactions, even if I'm seeing attributed ones? I mean, it's a great question. It's a great question because we hear it a lot. It's a great question because we can actually test it. We can go out and run a study with A and B, and we can draw a circle around just prior buyers in both groups, people who actually got ads and people who got a ghost ad. And we can prove or disprove whether that specific cohort makes an incremental or truly incremental transaction. And so we did that. And this is what we saw. Generally speaking, prior buyers are actually more incremental. Marketing myth buster, right? Because there's a lot of marketers out there that say, no, I don't need to show ads to my prior buyers. Well, you don't. You also don't need to grow your business. If you want to actually grow your business, the evidence indicates that there's actually more lift on buyers. Not always. Again, nothing's universal. Here's one where it's only 0.5, and here's one where it's only 0.86 of the value of non-buyers. But by and large, showing ads to people who've bought from you creates an additional transaction. Why is that? What happens when someone buys from you? Presumably, they have a great experience. Presumably, not always. Presumably, they got good shipping, it arrived, they like the product, even if they don't, they had a good returns experience. That is brand value that has been generated for that prior buyer. That greases the wheels for your marketing so that when you want them to buy incrementally, the right marketing can actually drive that incremental transaction. So with all that said, and that's kind of what I personally consider the gold standard, like these controlled studies, carefully thought out splits, blind and random, the use of ghost ads. There are many other ways, there are many other vendors out there that aren't necessarily bad. Even if we don't consider it the very best, I like to say don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good or the enemy of something that could still help you. Let's talk about some other approaches. There's a standard out there that I call ITT geotesting, which is the splitting of your market into geographical regions. For example, let's say you're operating, in Britain. You might be like, well, okay, I'm going to do one thing in London and Manchester, and then in the rest of Britain, I'm going to do something else. And then you could measure differences. Often related to TV, actually, because that's where this was birthed from, looking at TV markets. So if you're running TV also, it can kind of go nicely there. It does take a lot of time to run, and it sort of has to be done on a large scale. Like if you're only selling things in, say, the city of London, it's hard to split out geographic regions on a small basis because there's a large inaccuracy. Has anyone ever taken their phone out and said, where am I? There's websites that will tell you, where you are. Last time I did that, and again, a little US-centric, I live in Los Angeles, said I was in Nebraska. I've never even been to Nebraska. I'm not sure I can find it on a map. My phone's in Nebraska. What does that do to a geographic split test? Well, it puts my transaction from Santa Monica, California into Omaha, Nebraska. And as great as Warren Buffett is, there's only so much he can buy as a one-man show. So it's throwing off your statistics if you're using that kind of geographical resolution, and it's inaccurate. There's a lot of local factors. There's big snowstorms in Buffalo, New York, and we happen to be using that as a control market. Stuff like that happens. And it's really a big, blunt instrument. Compared to ghost ads, which doesn't require, going dark in DMAs because it's user by user, but it does require that you have a vendor that can do it. So there's nothing wrong with backing up to like geo-testing on an ITT basis, but you should be aware of where those pitfalls might be. The other thing is, as I mentioned, do you really know where you are? Do you really know where your customers are? That can be very difficult, and it's more difficult the more granular you need to get. Normally, you know what country they're in. You usually know something about the region. When you get down to the city level, again, depending on how your cities are set up, London's quite large, but out where I live, Los Angeles is a large city, but there's all these tiny little towns surrounding it. So if you're dealing with big regions that have lots of small cities around a major city, it's very difficult to know where someone is. And at postal codes, it's very hard. People using VPNs or, for example, in the United States, if you've been to New York City, you're in the state of New York. If you cross a river, literally go 1 mile, you're in the state of New Jersey. So people that do a geo split and say New Jersey's in my control group and New York is in my exposed, you're getting a lot of people exposed at work and not at home because they live in one and work in the other. So if you're running geo splits, think about where you're drawing your boundaries and making sure you're not having people part of the day in one and some of the day in the other one. The other thing is, control group selection. If there's a flood in Manchester and that was in your control group and everybody stayed home, that's a real problem. In Britain, the use of London in general, we believe, is problematic because it's such a dominant city. Whether you have it in one group or the other, you're taking like a huge influence there, and it's hard to fix that. And any localized effect could have bias. And here's an example that I pulled just for all of you. I'm sure a topic near and dear to your heart, which was Brexit. And it's a great example where even though the advertising split probably isn't quite as severe as Britain's views on Brexit, you can see the risk of geographic-based control groups. If Scotland was my control group here, you'd still be in the EU. So bottom line is, do you have any other options, and maybe some better ones than, you have to get a Trump joke in here, right, than trade deals with Trump. So yeah, there are a few other things. There's MMM and MTA, which are some other options that you'll hear around incrementality. So MTA stands for multi-touch attribution. And this was something that was getting a little more common in GA before they rolled to the new version. And it was people who said, I just can't believe that the last click represents all the value. I can't believe that there's a transaction and I'm going to give the full credit to the vendor that drove the last click before the transaction. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to take the last four clicks and give 25% to each of those. Oh, no. Jim over in analytics told me the one right before the transaction gets 50%, the one before that gets 10, the one before that gets 5, and then everything else is going to get the rest of that. Oh, okay, well, why did Jim from analytics tell you that? Well, I don't know, that's what Jim in analytics does. So the problem here is nobody really ever knew why they were assigning the amounts of credit they were assigning when you talk to people using MTA. And so it's kind of dying out. Now, that's a little bit of an opinion on my part, but there's just little to no proof that the weighting is correct. It's not necessarily better or worse, but it's hard to demonstrably show that. And it does sort of rely on third-party cookies, which I guess are going to be around now, at least in Chrome, but they've been long gone in Safari and other browsers. So there's a lot of reasons why MTA is sort of dying out. Replacing it is MMM, media mix modeling, which works very differently because it's not really an attribution system. This is user-based. This still requires that you understand things at the user level. This is not user-based. All right, a media mix model is where you say, hey, I have a bunch of different regions, and I apply different marketing inputs to those regions. Classically, it came from TV back in the 50s and 60s. I would run, a bunch of TV in London, and I'd run different TV in Manchester or Scotland. And then I would see, are there differences in my total sales in those areas? Okay, so MMM is sort of roaring back. One, because people are pulling away from MTA. Two, it's not user or cookie dependent. Again, very important, not user or cookie dependent. And again, it finds those variations in output, sort of having a moment in the sun because there's a lot of third parties, at least in the US, that have formed companies to use these alternative mechanisms. So, what do we think is next right now? Well, for all of you out there, if you're going to, you might already be doing a ton of incrementality testing. You might not be. If you're thinking about it, we think it's logical that you should start where the money is. So, if you rank order the spend that you're applying against all your marketing initiatives, start with your very biggest. Identify those high investment areas and think, could I do tests? Will the vendor do it for me? Do I have to employ a third party? How would I actually get those tests moving? What partners do this already? What can they tell me about best practices? What can they tell me about the kind of results I would expect? And how do I action that? One of the core actions, of course, is that if you know your true incremental ROAS across all vendors, is that's highly informative towards budget decisions. You can actually shift money such that it becomes more impactful if you move it from a lower iROAS or incremental ROAS vendor to a higher iROAS vendor. And then finally, there will be some alignment from internal stakeholders that you'll need because people will be tied to the systems that they're used to. Maybe not in marketing, even if you're sort of a champion for looking at incrementality, there might be a finance team that digs in on attributed metrics or other leadership. So we think that's important also. All right, we probably have a few minutes for any questions. Happy to take those. Yes, in the back.
Quick question on incrementality testing. A lot of the data is using sort of internal metrics. How do you account for what's happening in the market? So you mentioned things like customers coming back and using a voucher code. What if a competitor has a different voucher code and then that influences them to then switch to that competitor? Is there any way of then, it's always going to be slightly messy, I understand, but how do you control for the market environment around your internal data?
So great question. Broadly, if I'm interpreting it properly, is you've got all this other stuff going on in the market. For example, let's say you want to test RTB House. You're not going to change all your other marketing, right? You're still doing voucher codes. You're still doing email. You're still doing Meta. You're still on Google search. Great, right? Our view is we want you to do all that other stuff. We're going to then split the users on your website into a group we treat and a group we don't treat. But in both of those groups, everything else you're doing still goes on apace, which means that effect is the same in both the A and B or control and exposed populations. So under our methodology, at least under a true split of site users, where we specifically advise our clients, please don't change anything you're doing, the idea is to prove incrementality in the context of all your other background marketing. So in our specific implementation of it, that's not exactly an issue. It may be an issue if you're using like MTA or MMM or other things like that because they're not a strict test and control split. Other thoughts or questions? Yeah.
One of the challenges with this kind of testing is that to deal with internal teams, especially finance, they like to say, we can put X amount of money into marketing, and based on our attribution and some other methodology like that, we're going to get X amount out. And that's difficult when we start doing terms of testing across lots of partners. So how do you bring it all together? And do you have any sort of best practice or advice around that?
Yeah, great question. So I'm just going to repeat the questions since the audience is not mic'd. The question was, sometimes other teams like a finance team continues to look at attributed metrics in some system like GA. And when a marketing team moves towards incrementality, how do you help evangelize that that's the right approach, or how do you help convince others? It's not probably our foremost field of expertise, but sometimes we are invited to calls, even as RTB House, to explain the methodology and the results and why we think it's meaningful. So vendors like us are happy to help, and maybe some of your other vendors also, so you can lean in on vendors. There's also a lot of just kind of general literature out there, websites, videos, people on YouTube that have sort of come out and said, hey, you really should be looking at incrementality as opposed to just GA, a lot of third-party companies. So you have to, it kind of takes a village. It's hard to sometimes one-on-one go to finance, but if they start hearing it from a vendor or two, if they start seeing, oh, hey, you're sending me links to articles about how and why I should be measuring incrementality, they're often more open-minded than they may sound initially. All right, well, thank you, everyone. I'm going to turn it back to Howie at this point.
Thanks so much, Jaysen. Thank you, mate.